talk a little briefly about how we're going to do all this.
Please find a seat as quickly as you can. We're ready to get started. Glad everybody is socializing and networking already. That's a good sign. I'm Elliott, and the director of the Center for the Study and Prevention of Violence at the University of Colorado, and the co-editor of the Blueprint series. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you here to the third biannual Blueprints Conference. We're particularly glad to see all of you here. We were concerned with the economy, that it was going to be difficult for a number of people to come, so we're especially delighted that each of you made it. It's my understanding that we have 11 different countries outside of the U.S. represented. I want to especially thank those of you coming from outside the U.S. to this conference. I know that represents a lot of travel time and an expense, so we're particularly glad to have you here. Our hope is that in the next 2 days, you'll have a chance to learn a lot about evidence-based programs, a lot about what kinds of interventions are effective, what the standards are for deciding what evidence-based means. One of my great concerns is that term has been so diluted by people who use it without any real understanding of what it means. One of the members of our advisory board, who is sitting right down here in the front but is otherwise nameless, doesn't use that term anymore. He talks about effective programs because the term evidence-based has been used so loosely. But we're going to talk about that here at this conference. We're going to try to give you some specific definition for what that means, or what the standard should be for saying something's evidence-based. So one of the things I hope comes out of this conference is that you will promote the idea that evidence-based involves a standard, a scientific standard that needs to be met before we talk about a program being certified as an evidence-based program. And finally, what I hope happens is what most of you probably came from, a chance to meet one another, to network, to find out what other programs are doing and what kinds of programs other constituencies are implementing. So I encourage you in the times that we have for the networking to take advantage of that. So once again, we're off to a good start on this conference. And I welcome all of you and trust that the next 2 days will be rich and rewarding time for you. It's my pleasure to introduce Clay Yeager, who's going to be the moderator of this panel. Clay has been working with children at risk for over 35 years. He's had a wide range of different hats to wear. I was a little surprised in looking at his resume at the range of activities that he's had. He was a chief probation officer. He was a director of the Pennsylvania Juvenile Court Judges Commission Center for Juvenile Justice Training and Research. During Governor Tom Ridge's term, he served as the executive director of the Governor's Community Partnership for Safe Children. And he was later named the director of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And later, with Governor Schweiker, he was named as Executive Director of the Governor's Task Force on Early Childhood Education and Care. And then in July 2006, he served as President and Chief Executive Officer of the Nurse Family Partnership, Incorporated. Clay has been a consistent and long supporter of the Blueprints Initiative. As a matter of fact, Clay was in the state of Pennsylvania when we got our first grant to develop the whole Blueprint Initiative. And that involved a grant from the Crime Commission in the state of Pennsylvania, some money from CDC, and some money from the state of Colorado, and that was a very small amount. I think we started off with maybe $20,000. from those three sources. But Clay was there from the beginning, and so I think it's particularly appropriate that Clay is going to moderate this session. He was the first recipient of the Visionary of Pennsylvania Award for helping Pennsylvania to develop one of the most far-reaching and coordinated prevention strategies in the nation. In addition to that, he was recognized by the Pennsylvania General Assembly for his leadership in violence prevention with the Lifetime Citation Award. He currently manages his own consulting firm specializing in the healthy development of children by establishing partnerships between public, private, and nonprofit systems, and acts as a consultant to evidence-based associates. So it's a particular pleasure of mine to introduce to you Clay Yeager.
Thank you, Dr. Elliott. Good morning. I sometimes get embarrassed with that introduction because it sounds like I can't keep a job. We are surrounded by the company of giants today, and I want to introduce our panel. And Dr. Elliott, thank you for your leadership of the blueprints over all of these years. This is in many ways an historic gathering because many of the key principles of the initial Blueprints project are assembled on stage this morning, and it's a real honor to be part of this discussion. We have limited time, and there's a lot of important people who have a lot of important things to say up here. So my job is going to be to try to just kind of guide the horses and reach some consensus and introduce some issues. But let me first introduce the panel. To my immediate right, at the far end of the table, is Mr. Shay Bilchik. Shay needs little introduction to most of you in juvenile justice. He's the former administrator of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention during the Clinton administration and was instrumental in getting the Blueprints Project initiated in the mid-1980s or 1990s. Next to him is my very good friend and colleague, Dr. David Olds, who everyone knows as the founder of Nurse Family Partnership. Dr. Jim Alexander is a very dear friend who is the founder of Functional Family Therapy. On the far left of me and to your right is Dr. Gil Botvin, who is the founder and developer of Life Skills Training. Next to him is Dr. Mark Greenberg, a very close friend and associate, who heads the Prevention Research Center at Penn State and is the developer of Promoting Alternative Thinking Strategies. Dr. Scott Henggeler is the founder and developer of Multisystemic Therapy. And finally, Dr. Delbert Elliott, who needs little introduction as the leader and head of the Blueprints Project. Please join me in thanking and welcoming this wonderful group. Last fall, I watched on HBO the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. If there's going to be an evidence-based prevention Hall of Fame, these are the new inductees. I also want to mention that Dr. Mary Ann Pentz was scheduled to be here. She had a conflict at the last minute. Patty Chamberlain from Multidimensional Treatment Foster Care could not attend, and Dr. Dan Olveus, who developed the bullying prevention program, unfortunately could not come to the conference from Norway. So, we are ready, and for the next hour or so, we're just going to have a little intimate conversation in front of about 700 of your closest friends. Is that okay with you?
Sounds great.
I want to go back, first of all, to the mid-1990s. Can we go back that far? Can we remember? The mood of the country was kind of frightening, you see. There was a lot of attention about juvenile crime, violence. The super predator was being developed in some laboratory somewhere. We were told if we didn't do anything that we're going to have bloodbaths in the streets. School shootings, a lot of media attention, a lot of political elected officials kind of jumped on this. It's a good issue. So we were at a crossroads, I believe, in the mid-1990s, dealing with these new offenders. And Shay, you were sitting in the seat at OJJDP, and you were hearing among your colleagues in those political circles in the administration, Shay, we got to do something about this. What did you do?
This was probably the most difficult time period in my career in terms of being pushed and pulled on a set of issues and how you address them. I'd been a prosecutor for 16 years. I already knew what it felt like never to make everybody happy in a case. But we had this tremendous push from the Hill and tremendous push from the states that we need to know what to do to address the super predator. And Clay, it wasn't that they were coming. It was that they had arrived. So, wherever he is, John DiIulio, thank you so much for the super predator term, because it really created an edge to what we were doing in a very negative way. It took us away from a more thoughtful, deliberative process to understand and work with data and evidence about what was really happening, giving time to crunch those numbers and put us into hyperspeed in terms of having to react to some really negative things that were being proposed and actually that were carried out. Changing of state laws that dealt with transferring kids into the criminal court, extending jurisdiction, building more juvenile prisons, super prisons. So in answer to the question, what do? We tried to ride that wave in a way that would introduce a more reasoned approach to what was happening. We tried to use the federal leadership role at OJJDP to begin to build more science and evidence around what was happening out in the field, what the numbers really would be telling us, which, by the way, as we later found out, was that there was no super predator, and while crime was up, it certainly wasn't at the point in time we were having the discussion still up. It had already started going down. So we looked at this, Clay, as an opportunity to introduce more science, more evidence to what we were trying to do. By the way, at OJJDP, we had already adopted the approach of using the comprehensive strategy to reduce serious violent and chronic offending. That predated this hyperbole that John DiIulio and Jamie Foxx were putting out there. So our reaction was to go to the Hill and say, tell us what you need. What are the things you need from us? What knowledge do you need from us? And let us tell you what we know and what we can support to actually be smart about addressing juvenile crime. And that was really when, actually my initial conversation around the kind of effective programs was with David. And,
with Dr. Olds?
Yeah, a call to David, which I will never really forget. You may have forgotten it, but I called him up and said, I'm Shay Bilchik. I'm at the U.S. Department of Justice. At that point, I was still in my role as assistant to the Attorney General before I took over at OJJDP. And I said, I've read your research around nurse home visiting, and I'd like to see if we can create a partnership of some sort to advance this. And David's reaction was kind of like, okay, who are you? And where are you calling from? Because I expect the call to come from HHS, not from DOJ. And I think he actually said, give me a number I can call you back, because I want to go to the switchboard to make sure, it's really you in the line. So, and then we reached out to Del and said, you're developing the blueprints. What can we do to amplify that work? So there's a lot more to the story, Clay, but it really is pausing and saying, how do we educate people? In some ways, how do we, by stealth, do the things that need to be done, even when someone might call it something else? And then be very strategic in how we used our federal dollars to support smart people out in the field who knew a lot more about what was going on out there, than we did inside the Beltway.
I'd like to recreate that conversation you had with David Olds. I'm curious to know how that went. Dr. Olds.
Well, thank you. From my perspective, it's true. I was kind of astounded that we'd hear from someone from juvenile justice to talk about what we were doing during pregnancy in the first 2 years of the child's life. And we had, at that point, not seriously entertained any systematic, programmatic replication of the program we developed. We had just begun our third trial of the Nurse Family Partnership in Denver. And we had two major issues that were confronting us at the time. One of them was simply to know whether this program that we had developed and tested in, at that point, 2 sites, would really be replicable even in the randomized controlled trials we had conducted, whether there would be any enduring effects, and just as important, whether we would be able to replicate the program outside of these research contexts in a reliable way. And the kind of related issue to that is, will communities want to buy this? So, but with Shay's call, we decided it was time to wade into this really murky waters called policy and practice replication. And with in partnership with OJJDP, by the way, they didn't give very much money to this. they seeded this. They seeded the communities to, I think it was about $25,000 per community, to help them build an information system that would allow those communities to partner with us in essentially testing our capacity to help them develop the program well. What you did support well, and I really appreciate this, Shay, was money to evaluate this replication effort. And we developed a model for replication that tried to take into consideration the kinds of factors that we thought would be really important. And that had a lot to do with just selecting the right organizations, making sure the organizational capacity and culture were right, developing thoroughgoing training and technical assistance, developing an information system that would allow us to monitor performance of the program. All of that came from you folks, and that money did come to the University of Colorado. And that, in a way, allowed us to find that communities were interested in it. We had 3 times as many applicants to take Shay's seed money up and run with it at the local level. And we started to gain some confidence in our own ability to help train new nurses and nurture organizational commitment and capacity.
Dr. Olds talked about the murky waters of getting into public policy. Dr. Botvin, Dr. Greenberg, Dr. Henggeler, Dr. Alexander, is that to suggest that those of you in research and academia, this was an uncomfortable place for you, moving into public policy?
Absolutely. And it continues to be. Let me reframe things just a little bit, because I come at this very differently, from a different place than some of you, and certainly a different place than Shay. As was the case with David, I was very surprised one day to hear from Shay. Because up to that point in time, our work had focused mainly on smoking and drug abuse prevention, and had really no connection at all to OJJDP. So as I was telling Shay earlier today, in my view, he was a visionary working together with Del, 2 major visionaries, to see the potential of some of the work that folks like our group were doing, and others on the panel, in academia, to see the potential application in the area of juvenile justice. We started out at a time in prevention. My first job, I remember, was at a place called the American Health Foundation. I had just finished my PhD at Columbia, where I focused mainly on developmental psychology with training as well in clinical psychology. And my interest was in preventive medicine. My first job was at a place called the American Health Foundation. And my boss at the time, Ernst Winder, was the first individual to identify a connection between cigarette smoking and cancer when he worked at Memorial Sloan Kettering. And he said to me when I first arrived at that job, fresh out of graduate school, listen, I have an assignment for you. I want you to do something that everyone before you has failed at. Develop a smoking prevention program. And I thought, oh my God, this is my first job. I've only been here a few weeks. Boy, am I in trouble. I need to look for another job. And so what I did after I sort of got myself together and took a few steps back and a few deep breaths is I went to the literature to try to figure out what other folks had done, what worked and what didn't work. And unfortunately, what turned out to be the case is that he was exactly right, that nothing else had worked. So in the area of tobacco, alcohol, and drug abuse prevention, at that point in time, although there were a lot of important people doing major work, well-meaning work, when you subjected it to rigorous research, it turns out that although you could get effects for attitudes and effects on knowledge, that none of these earlier approaches could produce effects on what we cared most about, and that is demonstrating an impact on health behavior, in this case tobacco, alcohol, and illicit drug use. So at that point in time, nothing at all worked. And so the focus for us was to try to develop interventions that were somewhat theory-based at that point in time, based on what was available at that point in time in terms of etiology, and to try to put together something that might make sense in terms of a preventive intervention. And the goal for all of us at that point in time was to develop something that might be feasible, that might have the potential for being effective, and then to rigorously test it, first in small-scale pilot studies and later in larger-scale randomized trials. But we spent a decade trying to deal with the fact that nothing worked and trying to demonstrate that something could work. So we came at it from that point of view, and over time we got to the place where we have effective interventions, and now we're in the policy arena, which takes me back full circle to your question, and it's still an uncomfortable place to be, but it's an interesting and exhilarating time for us in prevention.
Dr. Greenberg, tell us about your background with PATHS and how you got it started.
Sure. PATHS is having its 30th birthday this year.
Happy birthday.
It began in 1980, so it's been a while. And I come from a developmental background. I really wasn't interested in delinquency, violence, drug use, or any of those issues. I was interested in how children learn to regulate their emotions. Because as a developmental psychologist, the fundamental issue for all of us, children, adults, is our ability to regulate our emotions. And when we can regulate them well, we do well in almost every area of our life. So we were very interested in how it is that children come to regulate their emotions and what schools could do, what teachers could do to support classrooms that would create an atmosphere and teach skills that would create well-being for children. It's interesting that the outcome of that, of course, is that we reduce aggression and violence. But the intent was not to reduce aggression or violence. It was to build children's developmental skills. I think Gil would say the same thing about much of the work you've done. David would say this. Scott would say this. And I think it's very important is that this relates to policy now, and that is we don't want to focus on the outcome so much as we want to focus on these developmental processes at all ages. We want to understand what the risk and protective factors are that lead children to do well, to create both communities and cultures, including classrooms as a kind of community that does that. And while we often get the moniker, because of policy, of violence prevention, or people are interested now in bullying, maybe bullying and cyberbullying being the big issues. Our goal shouldn't be really to prevent bullying. Our goal should be to build healthy communities and build children that have the skills that are necessary to resist bullying and to help friends and not be bystanders. And I think we would probably all agree on this is the case, is we want to build these developmental skills. Policy puts us in the place of the outcomes. And so that's always a little bit of an uncomfortable position for me, because I don't have a problem with wanting to reduce aggression or bullying or drug and alcohol problems, but we don't want to speak to the communities that way for the most part. We don't want to speak to families and children that way. We want to speak to them about what are the developmental skills that will lead people to have well-being, to have good relationships. So there's always that tension between these two, and how we speak differently to different audiences. So I put on my policy hat in Harrisburg or Washington. It's a very different hat than I have in a school building or a parent night.
Which hat are you wearing today?
I'm wearing both hats today.
Scott, take us back.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Mark and I we went to graduate school together. We took many of the same developmental courses, family therapy courses, community psychology courses. He went one way, I went a different way, and I'm thinking now maybe it's because I was more of an externalizer. Came from more of an externalizing family. And so I, as a new assistant professor, my first position was at Memphis State University. I'd always been interested in antisocial behavior, and it was a great field because nothing works. Right? And so if you ever have an opportunity, if there's ever a situation where something hasn't been invented, something hasn't worked, it's a tremendous opportunity to stake a claim. And when you started looking at the services that were available to treat delinquency at the time, it was at least obvious to me why nothing. I mean, people are doing Rogerian therapy and Gestalt therapy, one-on-one with kids in the room. It was all this really goofy stuff that couldn't possibly work with an antisocial adolescent if you knew anything about antisocial adolescents. And then you look at the work that was coming from Del Shop and other folks who were doing developmental longitudinal studies, and it painted a very clear picture that serious antisocial behavior was multi-determined. risk factors at individual, family, peer, school levels. And so I think the logical conclusion was, therefore, you need an intervention that can hit across these levels. And I think, from our family background, seeing the family as a primary conduit to make those changes. And so when I went to Memphis, I was very lucky, got a little LEA money, had a small research grant, had a clinic, one-way mirrors, like it was family therapy thing at the time, and set up these appointments, and no one came in. we had like an 80% no-show rate, and you can't publish an outcome study with an 80% no-show rate. And so, it was an efficacy trial, so the therapists with graduate students, and graduate students pretty much have to do what they're told, and they can't just quit like real therapists in the real world. And so I said, well, look, they won't come to us. Why don't we go to them? And we had some great students and started doing, that was really the origins of the home-based work that's now, major, that is a big part of the MST model. So that worked out, got some decent results. And then, talk about the 90s, I was very lucky because, I didn't have to deal with the broader policy issues. I wasn't involved in them. I was fully funded by NIH to conduct randomized trials of MST with really tough populations, violent chronic offenders, substance abusing offenders. So I could just didn't have to teach, didn't do service. I didn't do much of anything except the research and manage the research. I was really able to focus on that. And, we started getting good outcomes doing randomized trials with serious offenders in real world settings in collaboration with community mental health centers. And then what happened was, we started getting calls for, could we develop an MST program out here in Idaho or wherever, right? And my thought was, well, yeah, sure. That's the whole, it's weird. You spend 20 years doing research and, and you're an academic and you're a scientist, and then all of a sudden there really is now a direct relevance, and there's a real policy relevance, because you guys mentioned what was going on at the time. So we're decreasing criminal activity, we're keeping kids out of placement, so it's cost effective, and it's only logical that we should try to move it out into the field. And I can say that trying to move it out in the field is a lot more difficult than it is to conduct successful randomized trials. And it takes a whole different skill set than the academic skill set, which is more my forte. And we learned that the hard way over a number of years. And, now, then went on to change and have a dedicated organization, MST Services, that does the transport work. And that was a very, very wise move, but it was wise by necessity.
We're going to get back to that, but I want to hear from our friend Dr. Alexander. And I'm not going chronologically here, I just want you to...
Well, you got to the oldest.
Gee, I thought you were going chronologically.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear. What'd you say? I think that I was really a bit concerned about what I would even be able to say, and I think you can understand that when you listen to the articulation that you've already heard. We began working with delinquents. Our first quote study was in 1971, and our first two published research articles were in 1973, and that was a very long time ago. And I still don't think policy. I do notice, if you've been hooked on phonics and raised in, New York City, you realize that policy and police, they still end up with the same kind of sound. P-O-L-I-C, and then there's an E sound. So I really thought it was the same thing. We just started working with delinquents. And but the muddy waters, when you framed it in terms of muddy waters, I finally found a comfort zone. And when Clay was talking about us getting ready to do this panel, and he said one of the things, what were you thinking? By the time I said that to myself in preparation, it sounded more like, what were you thinking? And the truth is, I still don't know. When Del called, and that was, that's what's really opening thing. I felt a little bit, and I want you to have some compassion here. I felt like George Bush landing on the carrier, mission accomplished. You know, we have, I mean, here's this thing, this huge blueprints thing. With all this, they say, you have somehow arrived somewhere. It still feels like, I'm not sure where we're going, but I think we're making damn good time. And I'm not saying that to be cute. It is absolutely wonderful to realize for me, because we just started the same thing, kind of in the clinic, in the lab, working directly with delinquents and having no credibility, being literally laughed at. I remember going to conventions and you would be mocked if you said something like evidence-based or research. It meant you had no heart and no soul. And you may have brains, but they're really off in la-la land someplace. And I remember having to have these big discussions about why we're even doing what we're doing. And now, of course, it's changed quite a bit, but it was an interesting kind of journey. And I want to give Scott credit for that, because we've been, in 1893, it'd been 20 years since our first publication, and we kept looking at therapist characteristics and do things like this. And I was telling people I was from New York, but Scott actually came out and acted like he was from New York. And I want to give a lot of credit for that.
Because I am.
Yeah. If it had been up to me, we would still be tinkering in the garage and having a very good time learning things and trying to figure out how to help people. But it took, and I realize it took people, and I just give Scott the initial credit for that, for saying something's very wrong here, but doing it in a louder New York voice. And then I became, mostly through the blueprints, aware of more people that had a perspective far beyond mine. And so I still consider myself not doing policy stuff. I still consider what we do, and we're still doing it and having an awful lot of fun and a lot of very hard work doing it. Still building, trying to build the best thing that we can build in the garage, and then partnering with people who have a different perspective. And I think it's that partnership kind of notion is the only way to make this work, because no one of us or no one group of us can do it all. So that's why participating in this has been a wonderful experience.
Well, thank you. And so it sounds to me from hearing you that there are some common themes from your work. First of all, you've each been at this for a long time. 1971, 1960s.
77 for us.
77.
Younger.
And a couple of things that kind of resonate are that you did start this with the intention of being part of this vast public policy shift. And it's an area that you're somewhat uncomfortable with. And you've developed, each of you, if I look around the table, all of you have taken your products, your programs, from the university setting and have established a replication entity for all of your programs. And that's a great thing, and that makes it available and accessible and training and technical assistance. So then we go back to Shay and to Del. First of all, how do you keep these guys under control, Del? Or don't you try?
Are you kidding? There is absolutely no way. It's like herding cats.
So take us back. I'm really curious, I think the audience would be too, about how this got started with you and Shay. Did you call him, or did he call you, or how did this work?
Del, you tell your story.
Well, my recollection was that I approached Shay and was looking for a very modest level of support. And after some conversation, things turned in a much bigger direction than what I was thinking.
When was this? 1996, 5? When was
95, 96?
95, 96.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. My interest in this really grew out of real frustration. We were doing the state evaluation of programs for block grant money coming into the state of Colorado. And it was very frustrating to see how that money was being distributed. It was, first of all, it was distributed by a board that half of the members were appointed by the governor and half were appointed by the chairman of the Senate. And so it was a political organization, and there were no standards for how money was being handed out. So we were looking at that time, $6-7 million a year, and I just got really frustrated with that. And that led to thinking about how could we essentially proposed to them some standards that they ought to be using for what kinds of programs they funded. At the same time, I went through a major career change just about that same time, and the Carnegie Corporation offered to set up this Center for the Study and Prevention of Violent Behavior. I've been working with them on their adolescent development initiative. And that represented a huge change for me. I'd done basic research all my life up to that point in time, some randomized controlled trials, evaluation studies. But this was a center which was set up to do the translation of basic research findings into practical policy and practice issues. Because there was a great gap between what the research community knew and was doing and what was happening out in the field in actual practice and policy. And that was a huge change for me. I mean, before then I would avoid talking to reporters. And I didn't know how to talk to reporters. I was never trained to do that. And the whole policy issue and talking to politicians and talking to the staffs of senators and congressmen was a whole new experience that I really wasn't trained for. It had nothing in my graduate training was dealing with those kinds of issues. So essentially, we got some seed money, really, as I mentioned before, a small amount of money, and I sat down with Bill Woodward, who was the director of the Division of Criminal Justice in the state of Colorado at that time, and we started saying, well, what are we looking for? What are the standards we ought to have for programs? And that's where we came up with the standards for the Blueprint Initiative. We actually had a couple of issues, a couple of standards, which when we started looking back in the mid-90s, no one could have met the standard. We were looking for a program that not only had positive, significant effects with no side effects, but we were looking for sustainability as a criteria, because so many of the programs that I was familiar with had fairly quick, immediate effects which were lost within 6 months of the individual leaving the treatment setting. Behavior modification strategies, for example, often had that particular problem. But at that time, we also were looking for mediating effects analysis to demonstrate that the causal model underneath the rationale for the program was validated in the evaluation. We were looking for cost-benefit data. Evidence, that the effect size was large enough, given the cost, that it would pay to be involved in that. We gave up on those two standards. We couldn't find any program, actually, that met that standard at that time. So that's how we got started, and the real kickoff, of course, came when I talked to Shay, and out of a very, very generous grant from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, we attempted to put our 10 blueprint programs, each one of them in 10 communities. And that study was a study to see if we could, in fact, implement those programs with fidelity in real settings, and to see if we could do that. And we were measuring primarily fidelity to see if we could do that and achieve a good quality implementation. Then we got a second grant, which was focused specifically. OJJDP had money at that time that was specifically earmarked for drug prevention. And that led to us to put LST. I think in that particular case, we put LST in over 400 schools around the country. Again, looking at measuring the fidelity of that program. But that also provided funding for us to set up our advisory board. And I have to say that I think that we have the most expert panel of individuals who are knowledgeable about research and the practical limitations of doing research on our advisory panel. And that allowed us to set that advisory panel up, go back over and review those programs we had initially selected to make sure that the panel agreed with that initial assessment that we made, and we took off from that particular point. So it was primarily the OJJDP money which really got us off the ground and running.
He tells that story really well.
Very nicely stated. How about it, Shay?
So the context for that within the government was that we were trying to make sure that whatever OJJDP or whatever any other federal office had been previously that was considered a program office, that it really operated on a basis that was on research and was data-driven. And so we wanted to take the money that we had, which was grown to be fairly substantial, up to about $600 million, from about $89 million when I walked in the door, to leverage a small amount that we had at our discretion, which was always granted in a competitive or a sole source on a uniquely qualified basis, to leverage the rest of the money and to leverage the use of the state money that was coming in or foundation money that was coming in. So it's how do you make sure you point people to this knowledge base that was growing. And so that's what we do. We use an ecological model. We use the risk and protective vector science. We access the formula dollars, the Title V prevention dollars, even the juvenile accountability dollars, which even though the moniker was Get Tough, when you looked at the language, this, by the way, is the by stealth part. When you looked at the language, would fund just about anything you wanted to do, including diversion. So we really were, I think, trying to be creative in how to work with partners around this table, and then identifying someone like Dell, who could then take that generous grant and actually sub-grant it out in smaller pieces that would leverage other monies as well. So it really was a wonderful time with the President, an Attorney General, an Assistant Attorney General, all who were supportive of this approach, and a uniquely qualified staff that I had at OJJDP that could bring this to life.
Well, I don't want to add to your already egos here. Already feeling good about yourself, but on behalf of all the audience and everybody here, that's really visionary leadership, and I commend both of you for joining forces and making that partnership 15 years ago. It's really changed. It was transformational in this business.
But in common, in current lingo, it's just common sense.
Well, it is, but unfortunately, in public policy, sometimes they don't go together. Right? So we have this wonderful blueprints project, and at some point we could have probably a whole panel discussion just on the intensity of those reviews that your advisory group does, because if I recall, Del, the first wave of these programs, you selected 10, but there were 600 or 700 who sought the status. And so my hunch is that a lot of those 590 that were initially requested blueprint status are still in operation. And that's a challenge. And so we have in the FDA, in the Food and Drug Administration, it takes 13 to 18 years for a pharmaceutical company to take the product to market, to go through the research and testing and taking it to the market and going to FDA panels. And yet those medications are available instantaneously and almost always available to the people who need them right away. And so here we are 12, 15 years later, and we're all challenged by the fact that this is science. This is, you can take it to the bank, that if these programs are done properly and with fidelity, that we will change outcomes in kids and families and communities. And yet, we're not getting the traction that we had always hoped. And so let's try to sort through some of those issues with each of your programs. And like Yogi Berra said, predictions are hard to make, especially about the future. But what can we do to tweak the process to ensure that more kids and more families and more communities and more schools begin to adopt what we know are effective interventions and prevention programs?
Clay, can I take you up on that?
Absolutely.
So my first 20 years, I did all these randomized trials with PAS and showed it increased children's social and emotional competence and reduced their behavior problems. But when I go back to each of the places we worked 3 or 4 years later, nothing was left. So this problem of sustainability is a really big one, and it's especially the case for programs like Gil and I, because we can't be funded by Medicare or Medicaid, and there still is no national prevention infrastructure that leads communities to this. And so I became very interested, and the bigger question is, how do communities operate? And this is where projects like CTC and Prosper are so important. Because if you are just dealing with a single program where there is not a broader perspective in a community or a school district on how to maintain data over time to understand what the effects of your program are. You're thinking about one program rather than thinking about how programs articulate across developmental periods, which is what, for example, CTC does. It's very unlikely that this is going to have much staying power. And so, while we have the program...
So not grant funded, but something that's embedded. It's embedded locally. It's embedded in the way we live. Gil?
Yeah, no, I think Del is exactly right. That what we really need is to take what we've learned and to determine how best to integrate what we have into existing systems. We've moved from a point in the field where we focused on trying to demonstrate that certain kind of interventions would be effective. Then we looked at the impact on a variety of populations. We looked at the impact in terms of long-term durability. But now we're at the happy place of trying to grapple with the real world and with the diffusion, dissemination, and trying to promote the adoption of evidence-based prevention approaches in ways that lead to their sustained utilization. To do that, you can come at this in a couple of ways. I think Mark's right that we need to increase our prevention infrastructure, and things like CTC and Prosper offer tremendous potential in providing that kind of structure. But we also need a more clearly defined national prevention agenda or prevention policy that would help provide the support and the funding that's necessary to infuse prevention into existing systems. The whole movement for evidence-based prevention is a larger one than we're involved in. I work at a medical school, at Cornell's Medical School, and in medicine there has been this move towards evidence-based practice. But they have the luxury of not only being able to focus on what works best and things that are most cost-effective in terms of their outcomes and so forth, but they do have existing systems. So it's very easy, once you've identified an evidence-based approach in medicine, to then integrate that into the existing structure, into existing delivery systems. We don't have the luxury of that in prevention. They have existing funding. You can argue about whether the funding stream is appropriate, whether it needs to be adjusted in some way, but there is a funding stream for that kind of work in medicine. We don't have such a well-established funding stream for prevention. And one of the things that we've seen, as Mark indicated earlier, you can do a randomized trial in a community, but after the funding is gone and the trial is over, a few years later, it's difficult to see any remnant of the intervention in that community. And the main reason we hear from communities all the time is a lack of resources, a lack of funding. And in terms of school-based research, related to that is a lack of classroom time. So we do have to grapple with the best ways of infusing and integrating prevention into existing structures, or if that's not appropriate, we need to entertain strategies for developing new structures.
Clay, can I weigh in a little bit on this? I think that what Blueprints has done and what the Coalition for Evidence-Based Policy has done has been to elevate the discourse and to work with, say, OMB in helping to establish throughout government what are going to hopefully be higher standards for policy making and where we're going to invest scarce public resources. There are challenges with all of this. One of the challenges is political, because I think often and the other challenge has to do with sort of just existing culture within bureaucracies about the way you do business. And we've experienced this over the course of the last year in really intense ways. A year ago, the President proposed in his budget blueprint that $8.6 billion be put into home visiting by nurses for low-income, first-time mothers that would begin during pregnancy and follow the families to the second year of the life.
Excuse me, you said billion.
Billion. 8.6 billion that would be scaled up over a 10-year period. And they used the evidence that came from replicated findings from our randomized controlled trials to justify this. So it's really clear that the President intended this money to go to the Nurse-Family Partnership. And it scaled it up over this. It would be mandated funding over a 10-year period. Well, the President's budget went to Congress, and it went to Congress. A lot of vested interests in existing home visiting programs had friends who are members of Congress sitting on particular committees, and as this recommendation on the part of the President went through the congressional process, at the other end, there were efforts to water down the evidentiary standards, to make the program types more ecumenical. And what came out at the other end, at least in the Senate version, was a $1.5 billion effort scaled up over 5 years for, quote, evidence-based home visiting, where the standards were not the same. And that's actually what passed in healthcare reform. But even with, and so there is Peter Orzog at OMB made it clear, we thought clear, in a blog regarding teen pregnancy prevention and home visiting, that the administration was really committed to funding programs that met the highest tier of evidence. And that's where the vast majority of dollars for teen pregnancy prevention and for home visiting would go. As that gets processed in the rulemaking system, though, through the existing bureaucracy, those kinds of commitments on the part of administrative leadership don't necessarily get translated into the actual way in which the rules get written. So when it comes to teen pregnancy prevention, there's really one program that meets the kinds of standards that Blueprints would adhere to, calls for. As the rules got written for teen pregnancy prevention, 28 programs came up as a list of, quote, evidence-based programs that would qualify for federal investment. So what I see at least, is this both political and bureaucratic kind of counter-pressure to doing the kinds of things that we all would like to see done. So I think we have to grapple with that as we go forward. And honestly, I'm not sure what to do about it.
Can anybody offer a solution?
Well, I like to, FFT is all about reframing, which may be unnecessarily optimistic. But when I hear this, it's very frustrating. It's just frustrating to hear it. There are a couple of things that comfort me. They don't necessarily give me direction, but they comfort me. One is that I was trained originally as a linear thinker. That's science. You go from here to there. And to me, in some ways, we talk about follow-up periods and all the rest, but in some ways that's also very impatient. We know the paths. We know the truth. We're supposed to. And we tend to develop truth, as defined by randomized clinical trials, whatever. And then we ship it out, and we run into all these other kinds of issues. Like I said, that can be very frustrating. But once I started thinking in more open systems, dynamic systems, framework, and this is where the possible reframe comes in, this is very frustrating. On the other hand, there are always new inputs that in some ways, through our particular lenses, we are not naturally open to. And so somebody has to keep doing that. I don't like most of those inputs, and like I said, they're annoying and I think misguided. But I remember the co-author in our 82 book, Bruce Parsons, he decided to give up all this science and treatment development and move to Laguna Beach. And so he could have a house up Bluebird Canyon, because that's really why you do this, But the point is, he said after a couple of years, he said, I just need to talk to you, Jim. And I said, what's the matter? And he said, all of a sudden, my outcomes are getting worse. I'm very popular. I'm one of the few psychologists that have hospital privileges. But the outcomes are getting worse. And what he finally thinks he figured out was he got so good at knowing what to do, he was jumping ahead of the process. These are natural developmental processes, and he got to the place where he could get them into phase 2 before they were ready for phase 2, because he knew now what the path should look like. So that always, yes, it slows us down, and it, like I said, it's frustrating. I just keep hoping to. It's like I love and I value free speech. But boy, it annoys the shit out of me what a lot of people say, and I just do. I value that. So it's like I really value what open dynamic systems mean, although it's very annoying having to deal with it. But the opposite result is entropy. So I just kind of just this thing and say, let's just keep meeting, and God bless you for doing this, and just keep on working this together as best we can.
And I'm glad that you support free speech. I'm really impressed with that. Thank you.
I just exemplified why we shouldn't have free speech.
Dale mentioned, Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, my heart goes out to the prevention people because there isn't this infrastructure. And it's a really, and there's no doubt that the money is better spent I think everybody knows that it's better spent in prevention. You get more long-term payoff. We've been very fortunate, but we've kind of chosen to be very fortunate to focus on kids who are already costing systems lots of money, mental health, juvenile justice, and if you can have a program that prevents a number or a percentage of residential placements and incarcerations, it easily pays for the services. And then you have folks who are able to use either Medicaid dollars and combinations of state mental health dollars. I think for us really what the challenge was, though, is 15 years ago we were the lunatic fringe of mental health. I'd go give grand rounds like at Western Psych or something, and people would look and say, "You do what? You go into these high crime neighborhoods? Therapists work on weekends. They're available 24/7. You have a caseload of 4 or 5, and are you people out of your mind?" And that really was the impression. We've kind of come more mainstream now, which is why we're a really nice suit. But it's in the way, and I think what we've really learned is in the old days, and still in much of mental health, the way that you train therapists is a way that you develop programs and send models out to train therapists. And we've really learned that is not the way you're effective in disseminating and transporting programs. The way that you transport programs is you try to get the hearts and minds of the leadership in states, in counties, people that are able to look at, who are accountable for large amounts of dollars and can see, well, you can spend it here, right? Like you always used to say, you can spend it here.